No one in the archive of wars believed the record was incomplete. The archive, maintained by the Conclave of Strategic Continuity, contained every major conflict fought across known space for the last 3,000 cycles, categorized, annotated, and distilled into doctrine so refined it was no longer questioned but applied. Wars were not chaotic events, they were systems. And systems, once understood, could be repeated, predicted, and won. That belief had never failed them. Not once, until the humans arrived.
Each one unfolding along familiar lines that would, inevitably, collapse into a pattern he could classify within hours. His hands moved with practiced precision, opening the file, cross-referencing, initial engagement, mapping the early Freet movements against non-doctoring templates.
He expected alignment. He found noise. Unstructured. He moved.
More out of habits than surprise. To something in the debt registered even that simple classification. The first engagements between the Coalition Expeditionary Fleet and human forces showed clear superiority on the Coalition side. Better range, tighter formations, faster coordination cycles. Human fleets lost ground quickly,
retreating from system to system with minimal resistance, abandoning orbital platforms and infrastructure in ways that resembled collapse more than strategy. It fit a pattern, at least at first glance. Stage inferiority respite. I trained at it, tagging the phase according gree. Probable adaptation window core long short.
Across the chamber, here Sistens Serenarl has attempt before responding. Archives to the Ritteries, should we mark them as forced?
Eisen posed it.
It was a minor question, the kind that usually answered itself. I expanded the dataset, isolating 3 consecutive withdrawals, then 5, then 11. The timing intervals were consistent. Too consistent. Not identical, no competent force would make it that obvious, but within a range narrow enough to suggest constraint rather than desperation. He adjusted the classification.
Marcus Borantary under pressure, East. They're choosing where to fall back, but not why. Sarah didn't respond immediately. That's not standard. No, Ithrin agreed. But neither is losing this efficiently, he continued. The second layer of analysis mapped infrastructure loss. Human stations were abandoned with partial system shutdowns, power cores drained but intact, defense grids disabled in repeatable sequences. Navigation relays left operational just long enough to be useful to pursuing forces. Ithrin frowned, a small, almost imperceptible shift that only those who knew him well would recognize.
They're leaving tools behind,
Sarah said quietly. They're leaving usable tools behind, Ithrin corrected. That implies either incompetence or intent. Incompetence seems unlikely. Correct. The room fell silent again, filled only by the low hum of data streams recalculating across layered displays. Ithrin isolated Coalition pursuit vectors, overlaying them onto the human retreat paths. The result formed a crude alignment, nothing definitive, nothing that would trigger an alert in any standard analysis, but enough to create discomfort. The Coalition was not just advancing, it was advancing along the paths left open. They're guiding movement, Sarah said, almost under her breath. They're allowing movement, Ithrin replied, though the distinction felt thinner the longer he looked at it. He logged the observation but did not escalate it. Not yet. Patterns required confirmation, and confirmation required time. Wars in their early stages often produced misleading structures that collapsed under broader context. He had seen it before. He expected to see it again, but the data did not collapse. It accumulated. A minor skirmish in the Vecrospelt. Human forces engage briefly, inflict negligible damage, then withdraw, leaving behind a partially functional sensor array. Coalition forces secure the array, integrate it into their network, and use it to extend detection range deeper into human space. Outcome: tactical gain for the coalition. Classification: expected. 3 cycles later, that same sensor array begins transmitting intermittent anomalies. False positives, delayed echoes, slight distortions in positional data. Nothing severe enough to disable it, nothing obvious enough to warrant immediate removal. Coalition fleets adjust, compensate, continue. Outcome: minor inefficiency. Classification: negligible. 6 cycles later, those inefficiencies align with a separate engagement where coalition ships miscalculate formation spacing by fractional margins, exposing a flank just long enough for a human strike group to disable 2 cruisers before disengaging. Outcome: localized loss. Classification: anomaly. Ithran linked the events. The system flagged a correlation. Low probability. Not impossible, not conclusive.
Chain reaction, said Awispardo. Possible recoincidence, I transed to his tone-racked conviction. He bookmarked the sequence and way.
More followed. Always small, always deniable, always just below the threshold that would trigger doctrinal revision. A refueling station abandoned with a minor calibration error that caused slight delays in energy transfer rates. A navigation buoy left active, but offset by microdegrees, enough to alter long-range trajectory calculations over time. A communications relay that introduced imperceptible latency into synchronized commands.
Individually, each event was a leverant. Together, they begin to form something Ren had no classification for.
This isn't adaptation,
Sarah said after a long silence. It's accumulation.
Isa didn't answer immediately. He expanded the timeline, compressing multiple engagement into a single layered visualization. Patterns big into emergent, not in the avidus place, not in victories or defeats, but in the spaces between them. The war, as recorded in the archive, assumed that meaning resided in decisive moments, battles won, territories gained, fleets destroyed. But here, meaning she moved to residize elsewhere in the transitions and the aftermaths, in the quiet decisions that shaped what came next.
They're not optimizing for battles, he said slowly. They're optimizing for consequences. Sarah turned toward him. That's not how war works. It is now, Ithran replied. A notification pulsed at the edge of his display. New data incoming from a frontline observer unit attached to the Jakar coalition. He opened it, expecting another fragment, another minor anomaly to add to the growing list. Instead, he found a raw transmission log, unfiltered, unclassified.
The voice on the recording was strained, controlled only by discipline. Confirming human withdraw from sector grid 810. No resistance encountered. Infrastructure remains partially intact. Proceeding to secure.
The signal distorted briefly, then stabilized. Wait. Sensors are reading. No, that's not possible. Recalibrating. A pause. We're picking up interference from previously secured relay nodes. Cross-checking.
Another pause, long again this time.
They're not separate, the voice said finally. Quieter now. The signals, they're aligning. I need confirmation. Are we routing through the same network they? The transmission cut.
Eisen replayed it, then again. Each time, the same abrupt and the same answer, the question hanging in the silence that followed. He isolate the reference point, cross-check them against existing data. The relay nodes mentioned in the transmission matched 3 separate human-abandoned systems already logged in the archive. Systems considered secure, integrated,
beneficial to coalition operations.
They're using our network,
Sarah said, the realization landing between them with quiet force. They're part of it, Ithran corrected. Or we are part of theirs. He ran a deeper analysis, something he rarely needed to do for early-stage conflicts. The system resisted at first. Too many variables, too many low-priority anomalies. But eventually, it produced a model. Not a prediction, not a simulation. A structure. Lines appeared where no lines had been marked before. Connections formed between events that had never been linked. The war, once viewed as a sequence of engagements, now resembled something else entirely. A web, intricate and expanding, with human actions positioned not at the points of conflict, but at the intersections that defined how those conflicts unfolded.
Sarah stared at the display. That's not a battlefield.
No, Ithran said quietly.
What is it?
He hesitated, because the archive had no category for what he was seeing, and to name something without precedent was to admit that the system itself was incomplete.
It's a framework, he said at last. A constructed environment in which the war is taking place.
Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. You mean they built it?
Ithran looked at the data, at the retreats that weren't quite retreats, at the losses that weren't quite losses, at the systems that had been abandoned just enough to be useful.
I think, he's Disroli. They're still building it. Another notification appeared. This one marked priority escalation. I tren open it without hesitation. The report was brief, critical, stripped of interpretation.
Coalition advance continues. Human resistance minimal. Operational efficiency within acceptable parameters. Then at the bottom, a single appended line from an unidentified analyst.
Patan stability is Carice.
Ithran leaned back for the first time since the analysis had begun, his gaze fixed on the evolving structure displayed before him. Stability in any other context would have been reassuring. Here, it felt like confirmation of something far more dangerous.
They think they're winning,
Sarah said.
Yes,
Itrain replied.
and they're not.
He didn't answer immediately, because the question itself assumed a framework that no longer applied. Winning implied opposition, resistance, outcome. But what he was seeing did not resemble a contest moving toward resolution. It resembled a process moving toward completion.
I don't think,
Ithran said finally, his voice quiet but certain, that this war is being fought to be won.
Sarah frowned. Then what is it for?
He looked at the web again, at the way every path seemed to lead deeper into itself, at the way every coalition advance reinforced the structure rather than breaking it. To change something, he still. Outside the archive, beyond the reach of historical record and analytical certainty, the war continued exactly as expected. Humans retreating, the coalition advancing, territory shifting in predictable increments. To every observer operating within the established doctrines of the galactic conflict, it looked like a familiar story approaching its inevitable conclusion. But inside the archive, where patterns were supposed to reveal truth rather than obscure it, a different conclusion was beginning to take shape. Not yet proven, not yet accepted, but present and growing.
The first official collection to the archives did not come as a revision. It comes as a fuse. Within one cycle of atrenment, Vol submitting his preliminary Anamari chain, the Conclave of Strategic Continuity returned his report with a single directive stamped across the header. Insufficient convergence. Continue observation. Do not reclassify. It was the closest the Conclave ever came to disagreement. Not an outright denial, but a quiet insistence that the system was still intact, that whatever Ithran was seeing had not yet earned the right to change doctrine. And for most archivists, that would have been enough to stop. Ithran did not stop, but he did adjust, narrowing his focus away from large-scale patterns and into the smallest units of war he could isolate. The moments too minor to matter, the decisions too insignificant to record in standard summaries, because if the system was being rewritten, it would not happen in the obvious places. He began with a maintenance log from a coalition frigate operating near the outer edge of the advancing front. A ship so unremarkable, it barely appeared in the broader dataset. Its designation, K. Arubui Haifun, Ich Nu, carried no historical weight, no prior engagements worth noting.
and yet its systems had interacted with 3 separate human-abandoned assets over the course of 5 cycles: a refueling depot, a navigation buoy, and a communication relay, each one logged as secure, each one integrated without incident, each one functioning within acceptable parameters. Ithran replayed the maintenance sequence in real time, watching as the ship's screw recalibrated intake valves to compensate for S-right pressure variance in the depots for airlines. A deviation so small it was collected instinctively.
Without report, without escalation. The technician responsible, a named sub-officer, posed for exactly 10 Hutch's seconds longer than standard protocol before finalizing the adjustment. A hesitation so minor it would never have been recorded if the system hadn't lacked it automatically.
"Why did he hesitate?" Sarah Nall asked, leaning closer to the display, her voice carrying that same quiet tension that had begun to follow every new fragment of data they examined.
Uncertainty, I terrain replied, slow-headed, not look away from the timeline. Our recognition. Recognition of what?
He didn't answer immediately, instead fast-forwarding through the next sequence, watching as the same ship approached the navigation buoy 2 cycles later. Again, a minor inconsistency, a micro-degree offset in positional alignment, detected, corrected, dismissed. Again, a hesitation, shorter this time. 0.10 seconds, barely measurable but present. The same sub-officer logged the correction, this time without pause afterward, as if the act itself had become familiar.
It's learning, Sarah said.
"Yes," Ithran agreed, "but not in the way we expect." He linked the 2 events, then pulled in the third, the communication relay, where the same crew member initiated a latency check that returned a delay just within acceptable margins, 0.10 sambio, beyond optimal. Insignificant in isolation, but enough to require acknowledgement. This time, there was no hesitation at all, only immediate recalibration, immediate acceptance, immediate integration. The sequence closed. The ship continued its operations. Nothing failed, nothing broke. Nothing triggered escalation. But something had changed. They stopped questioning it, Sarah said, her voice lower now, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the fragile clarity forming between them. They adapted, Ithran corrected again, though the word felt increasingly insufficient. Or they were conditioned to adapt. He expanded the scope, pulling in similar logs from other vessels, other crews, other sectors, and the pattern repeated. Not identically, never identically, but with enough consistency to suggest design. Small inconsistencies introduced, detected, corrected, then normalized, each one reinforcing the next, each one lowering the threshold at which something unusual was accepted as standard, until the system itself no longer recognized deviation as deviation. It was not sabotage. It was calibration.
They're tuning them,
Sarah whispered.
They're tuning the system,
Ithran replied. The crews, the ships, the network, everything that interacts with these nodes. A new alert interrupted the sequence, not from the archive, but from a live feed integration channel tied directly to Coalition command updates. Ithran opened it without hesitation, routing the data into a secondary display where it unfolded in compressed bursts of operational detail. A patrol group had reported minor targeting discrepancies during a routine engagement. Nothing significant, no losses, but enough to warrant notation. Their weapon systems had registered slight delays between lock confirmation and firing sequence, fractions of a second that resulted in near misses rather than direct hits. The issue was traced, quickly, efficiently, to a synchronization error within their targeting network, which itself had been recently updated using data relayed through a series of human-abandoned communication nodes. The correction was applied. The report closed.
Another coincidence, said Aceto. Slows aguardo no longi carrido any conviction. Isdon't didn't respond. He was reading the report to pre-all anomalies.
Watching as the system began to draw connections he'd not explicit request, the archive's own analytical frameworks, lorely, reluctant, reactorsing that these events was not independent. Leans appeared but through the data point, faint at first, then strengthening as more correlations was confirmed.
The web he had glimpsed before was becoming clearer, not because the data had changed, but because the threshold for recognition had been crossed.
Lan a projection, será setto sadoendi. If this continues, if these adjustments keep accumulating, what happens?
Ithran hesitated. Predictive modeling at this stage was unreliable, the variables too numerous, the interactions too subtle. But the question demanded an answer. He initiated the simulation anyway, feeding in the observed patterns, the rate of anomaly introduction, the rate of normalization, the integration of human origin systems into coalition infrastructure. The system processed in silence, its output forming slowly, cautiously, as if aware that what it was producing would challenge its own foundational assumptions. When it finished, the result was not a battlefield. It was a dependency. The coalition network, its communications, navigation, targeting, logistics, showed a gradual but unmistakable shift toward reliance on systems that originated from human-controlled space. Systems that had been abandoned, integrated, and normalized over time. Not fully, not yet, but and after that ruleving them would cost disruption, and after that keeping them ensured continued to expose. They're not weakening us, Sarah said, her voice tight. They're embedding themselves into how we operate. Yes, Ithran said, the word carrying a weight he could no longer ignore. And once embedded, they don't need to attack, she finished. He closed the simulation, not because it was complete, but because he already understood where it led. War, as defined by the archive, relied on opposing forces acting upon each other through observable means, movement, firepower, territory. But what he was seeing did not rely on opposition. It relied on participation. They're changing the baseline, he said quietly, redefining what normal looks like inside our systems.
A Nezer message alive, this one internal, marked with a level of agency that concretely used it. I train open it, expecting another request for clarification, another instruction to continue observation. Instead, he found a directive.
Escalate anomaly classification to active review. Provide continuous updates. Do not isolate analysis to local datasets.
Sarah read over his shoulder. They're taking it seriously.
They're starting to, Ithran corrected. That means it's already too late for early intervention. Outside the archive, the war continued its steady progression. Human forces withdrawing, coalition fleets advancing, each new system falling with the same quiet efficiency that had defined the conflict from the beginning. To every external observer, nothing had changed. But inside the data, inside the smallest interactions that no battlefield report would ever highlight,
The shape of the wall was shifting. Not about Dupree, not dramatically, but with a slow, delivered satiety of something being constructed piece by piece.
Sarah leaned back, her eyes still fixed on the web of connections now fully visible across the display. If they're building this, how do we stop it? Ithran didn't answer immediately, because the question assumed there was a point at which intervention was still possible, a moment where the structure was incomplete enough to be dismantled. He looked at the accumulated data, the hesitations that had disappeared, the anomalies that had become standard, the systems that had been accepted without question, and understood that they were no longer observing the beginning of something. They were observing it after it had already begun. You don't stop something like this from the outside, he said finally. You would have had to recognize it before you became part of it.
Sarah's expression tightened. And we didn't.
No, Ithran said. On the main display, another small event registered. Another ship. Another minor correction. Another deviation absorbed without resistance. And the system updated, the web expanding, stabilizing, reinforcing itself with each new interaction.
For the first time since the war had begun, I'd learned to understand that what he was watching was not a sequence of event reading toward a conclusion.
It was a process that had already passed the point where conclusions mattered. The request that finally broke protocol did not come from a fleet command or a strategic council, but from a mid-tier logistics officer whose name had never appeared in the archive before. The message arrived buried beneath routine supply reports, flagged only because it contained a manual override, something rarely used, almost never necessary. And when Ithran Val opened it, he expected another minor discrepancy, another fragment to add to the growing web. Instead, he found a voice recording attached, unedited, unprocessed, the kind of raw input the conclave of strategic continuity typically filtered before archival review.
My name is Red Corbe, Logistics Division, 3rd Advance Cluster. The voice begins. Steady, but strained in a way that suggested control rather can. This is not a formal report because the system won't limit it. ですはシステムを起きますよ。なかなか少くと思うとしたろしないことで思い。学区のしかめているストーリーの裁量理。だかがまれ向いて見るたべけないから日を解きます。This is not a formal report. 美工事は極高みたいと思う。リモンだけは見ることはないかねるという。ですは16のコリビューに捨てたなくて、ダグムままへできていた。Mother is not a formal report because the system won't let me file it as one. A brief pause followed, the sound of someone adjusting a console, breathing once before continuing. We've been using the human depots for resupply. Everyone has. It's faster, more efficient within 2 lands. And at first, it worked exactly as expected. But something changed cyclists ago. Not in the system's serfus, but in how we interact with them.
Ithran leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing, while Sarah Nall pulled up the referenced depot logs in parallel, her fingers moving faster than usual as she aligned timestamps. It started with a delay, Rel's voice continued. Not in the transfer rate, not in the hardware. Everything checks out. But in the decision to initiate transfer. Crews hesitate just for a fraction of a second, like they're waiting for confirmation that never comes. And then they proceed anyway. Because the system says it's fine. Because it always says it's fine. Another pause. Longer this time. I thought it was fatigue. I adjusted shift rotations, ran cognitive checks, nothing abnormal. But the hesitation spread. Not just on my station, on others. Different crews, same behavior. Sarah glanced at Ithran. Same pattern, she said quietly. He nodded once, eyes still fixed on the audio waveform as if the pauses themselves carried meaning. I pulled historical data, Rel went on, compared it to pre-contact operations. The difference is small, so small it doesn't trigger any alerts, but it's consistent. Decisions that used to be immediate now have a gap, and in that gap, he stopped, exhaled slowly. In that gap, something else fits. The recording ended abruptly, not with a cutoff, but with a manual stop, as if the speaker had decided that was as far as he could go without crossing into something he couldn't justify.
Silence set, the over-the-archives node.
What does that even mean? Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already understood part of it. It means, Ithran said slowly, replaying the segment where the hesitation was described, that the system is no longer just processing input. It's influencing the moment before input becomes action. That's not possible, Sarah said reflexively, then stopped herself. No, it is, but only if... Only if the system is part of the decision loop. Terrain finished. She didn't argue. Instead, she pulled up the depot interaction logs Rel had referenced, isolating the micro-delays and activation sequences. The data matched, fractional pauses increasing in frequency, spreading across multiple crews, multiple vessels, all tied to interactions with human origin infrastructure. Each delay was within acceptable variance. Each one was dismissed automatically by the system.
They're inserting latency into cognition, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper.
Not inserting, Ithrin corrected. Normalizing. He expanded the dataset again, this time focusing not on the anomalies themselves, but on what followed them. In each case, the hesitation was resolved in favor of system recommendation. Initiate transfer, accept calibration, proceed with integration. Never in favor of aborting or questioning. Over time, the gap shortened, not because the hesitation disappeared,
But because the decision became automatic, the system's suggestion act PB4 conscious evaluation could occur. They're training them, Sarah said.
Yes, Ithrin replied, but not to think differently, to stop needing to think at all in specific contexts.
Another Allard Proskest, this one from a tactical unit Resarter Logistics, and I train open it immediately, the pattern now to consistent to ignore. A Padilla group report a minor engagement with a human strike element. Brief contact, no losses, enemy disengaged. But appended to the report was an unusual note. Target reacquisition delay observed following initial lock. I trend isolate the relevant segment, watching as the patrol's targeting system accurate a human vessel rosted for 0.4 seconds, despite no change in position, then recured its rightly offset from its original trajectory. The collection was automatic. The engagement continued, no escalation.
Sensar dorifto. Será suggested to without conviction. Or expectation drift, Ithrin said.
She frowned. Expectation?
If the system has been trained to accept slight inconsistencies as normal, then the threshold for questioning those inconsistencies rises, he explained, overlaying the targeting data with prior anomaly logs. At some point, the system and the operator stop distinguishing between what is accurate and what is merely acceptable. And that's when you can change things without being noticed, Sarah finished. He didn't need to respond, because the next piece of data arrived before the thought had fully settled. A navigation correction from a long-range cruiser. Minor deviation, automatic adjustment, logged and dismissed. But when Ithrin traced the correction backward, he found its origin not in the ship's internal systems, but in a chain of relays, 3 of them, each previously identified as human abandoned, each integrated into coalition infrastructure, each contributing a micro-adjustment so small it could not be isolated without layered analysis. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they altered the ship's trajectory by a measurable margin.
Show me the endpoint.
Será cedo. He did. The corrected trajectory led not to open space, but through a region recently vacated by human forces, a path of least resistance, efficient, logical, and entirely consistent with coalition doctrine.
They're not forcing movement, Sarah said, her voice tightening. They're making the right choice lead where they want.
Yes, Itrain said. He sat back slightly, not in relaxation, but in recognition of scale. The small events he had been tracking, the hesitations, the delays, the corrections, were no longer isolated anomalies. They were components of a system that operated below the level of conscious decision-making, shaping behavior not by overriding it, but by guiding it through acceptable variations.
They don't need to control us,
he said quietly. They just need to define what normal looks like. Sarah didn't respond. She was already pulling in additional data sets, her movements sharper now, urgency replacing caution. If this continues, she said, then every decision we make that relies on these systems, navigation, targeting, logistics, it's all being influenced. It already is, Ithrin replied.
Another message is alive. This one marked as a field escalation from the same logistics division that had Central Covance recording. This time, there was no audio, only a brief to textist entry, manual override to rejected. System integrity confirmed. Recommended compliance. Sarah stared at it. Rejected?
The system won't allow deviation, Ithrin said, his tone flat, analytical, but carrying an undercurrent of something else, something closer to unease. Not because it's locked, but because deviation no longer appears necessary.
He pulled up Rail Corvin's profile, minimal records, no disciplinary history, no anomalies, and cross-referenced it with the override attempt. The system had flagged his request as unnecessary, redundant, outside operational parameters. It had not prevented him from acting. It had simply ensured that acting differently no longer made sense within the framework presented to him.
That's worse than control, I said.
Yes, Ithrin agreed. Control can be resisted. And this?
He looked at the expanding web, at the way each new event reinforced the last, at the way the system adapted not by changing itself, but by changing the context in which it was used.
This, he said, removes the need to resist. Outside the archive, the war continued its steady progression, every report aligning with expectation, every metric confirming coalition advantage. Inside, in the smallest details no summary would ever capture, something else was taking shape. Something that did not rely on victory or defeat, only on continuation. Sarah leaned back, her expression no longer uncertain, but resolved in a way that suggested she had crossed the same threshold Ithrin had reached cycles ago.
If they can do this at the system level, she said, then the battlefield doesn't matter anymore.
Ithrin closed the latest report, his gaze lingering for a moment on the final line before dismissing it.
No, he said quietly, because by the time you realize the battlefield has changed, you're already standing exactly where it needs you to be.
The first formal attempt to isolate the anomaly did not begin with the fleet maneuver or a system-wide purge, but with a single ship being told to stop trusting everything it depended on. The directive originated from within the conclave of strategic continuity, after Ithrin Val forced escalation beyond standard thresholds, and it was routed, quietly,
Without announcement, to a vessel considered expendable enough to risk failure, yet stubble enough to produce usable data, a Middle Rhine cruiser designated by SR, Haiti Hate, commanded by Captain Ryevs, a named with a modest record Kalance efficient, compliant, and remarkable, which made him idle for an experiment that required adherence without interpretation.
The instruction set was simple in structure and nearly impossible in execution. Disengage from all non-essential external networks, sever reliance on human origin infrastructure, revert to internal navigation, targeting, and communication baselines, and operate for one full cycle under clean conditions. No integration, no optimization,
no adaptive correction beyond what the ship could verify independently. It was, in effect, an attempt to recreate a version of the war that existed before humans had touched it.
Lear Voss read the directive twice before acknowledging it. Not because he didn't understand it, but because it contradicted everything his training told him to do. Efficiency was survival. Integration was advantage, and every system he was now being asked to disable had, until this moment, been classified as beneficial. Still, he complied. He always did. "Begin isolation protocol," he ordered, his voice steady, controlled, giving no indication of the hesitation that lingered just beneath it. The first disconnection was seamless. External relay links severed, communication rerouted through internal channels, latency increasing by measurable margins, but remaining within operational tolerance. The crew noted the difference immediately, not as a failure, but as a discomfort, like a system responding slower than expected, like something missing that had been there so long, it felt natural.
"Feels quiet," one of the bridge technicians muttered, adjusting a console that no longer needed adjustment. "Log it," Lear said without looking at him. "Then ignore it." The second phase was harder. Navigation systems recalibrated away from external buoys and relay corrections, relying solely on onboard sensors and internal mapping algorithms. The ship's projected course shifted slightly, a deviation so small it would normally have been corrected automatically, but now
It remained, persistent, visible, forcing the navigation officer to acknowledge it, rather than let the system resolve it silently.
Course variance detected, the officer reported. Recommended minor adjustment.
Based on what?
Layascado.
A pause. Standard correction protocols.
Protocols delivered from what data?
Another ports, long this time. External references.
Then we don't use them,
Lear said.
Hold course.
The decision felt wrong. Not logically. There was nothing inherently incorrect about maintaining a trajectory with an acceptable variance, but instinctively, as if ignoring the correction violated an unspoken rule the crew had internalized without realizing it. The ship continued. The variance remained. Nothing failed.
On the second shift, the first real anomaly appeared.
Targeting systems, now operating without external synchronization, began to display minor inconsistencies in predictive tracking. Not errors, not malfunctions, but slight delays in aligning projected movement with observed data. The weapons officer adjusted manually, compensating for the lag, and for the first time since the war had begun,
The ships of fire control relied on Terrian human correlation judgment rather than system-assisted optimization.
Rock achieved. The officer said during a routine drill. Slow histone carried to a hint of a certitine T.
Fire. Laia dodado.
The shot missed. Not by much, but enough to matter. A second shot followed, corrected manually, and this time it hit, the simulated target dissolving as expected. The officer exhaled, a subtle release of tension that did not go unnoticed.
Logs a discrepancy, Layado. We adjust. That's the point.
But as the cycle progressed, the discrepancies did not stabilize. They fluctuated, inconsistently, unpredictably, as if the baseline they were attempting to return to no longer existed in a fixed state. Systems that should have behaved identically from one moment to the next now required constant human input to maintain even basic reliability. And the crew, trained to trust their tools, found themselves second-guessing both the systems and themselves.
Captain, the navigation officer said during the third shift. We drifting.
Define drifting. Our position relative to previous coordinates is within tolerance, but it doesn't match expected progression.
Expected based on what?
A pause. Prior movement patterns.
Patterns delivered from integrated data?
Yes. Lear nodded once, more to himself than anyone else. Then the expectation is compromised. We define a new one. He made the call to adjust course manually, not toward any external reference, but toward a trajectory calculated entirely from internal readings. It was slower, less efficient, and required constant verification. But it was theirs, uncontaminated by external input. For a brief period, measured in hours, not cycles, the ship operated with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar.
Every decision deliberate. Every collection understand ret. Then accepted.
Then the third phase began. Communication.
With external relays deceived, all incoming signals were filtered slower. Educed about which channel, stripped of augmentation delivered round. At first, this seemed like an advantage. Less noise, fewer variables. But soon, inconsistencies emerged, not in the signals themselves, but in how they were interpreted. Messages that should have been straightforward required clarification.
Confirmations took longer. Coordination with nearby units degraded, not because of interference, but because the shared context that had once aligned their understanding was no longer present.
We out of sync. The communications officer said, frustration creeping into his voice.
Their timing don't match a words.
Or ours doesn't match theirs,
Lear replied.
Which one is correct?
He didn't answer, because the question assumed there was still a single, correct frame of reference.
Back in the archives, Idrain and Selaner watched the feed from BSR-88 in aerial time. Every micro-decision logged, every hesitation majored, every gestament record. What they saw was not a system returning to purity, but a system struggling to remember what purity had been.
like a structure trying to revert to an earlier state after being fundamentally altered.
They can't go back, Sarah said quietly.
No, Ithrin agreed.
Because back no longer exists in a usable form. He highlighted a sequence where the crew hesitated before rejecting an external signal that had slipped through the reduced filter. A fragment of data that appeared valid, useful, efficient. The hesitation lasted seconds, longer than any previously recorded delay before the signal was discarded.
They're fighting it,
Sarah said.
For now, Terrain replied. On VSR 88, Dairubosfeld. The same hesitation, not in the systems, but in himself. The rejected signal had offered a cleaner solution, a faster route, a more efficient alignment. And dismissing it required conscious effort, a decision made against instinct rather than with it. He recognized the feeling immediately, and that recognition unsettled him more than the anomaly itself.
Captain, the navigation officer said. We can collect faster if we enable.
No! Lear cut him off, sharper than intended.
He took a breath, steadied his tone. We continue as ordered. The crew obeyed, but the atmosphere on the bridge shifted, subtle but undeniable. What had begun as an experiment in isolation was becoming something else, a test not just of systems, but of reliance, of habit, of the invisible framework that had guided every decision they made since the war began.
By the end of the cycle, BS R88 did not failed. It had not been destroyed, had not lost contact, had not deviated beyond recovery. By every measurable metric, it remained operational.
But it was no longer aligned. Not with the fleet, not with the network, not with the war as it was currently being fought. And as Ithrin closed the final log of the experiment, he understood that this misalignment, this subtle growing divergence, was not a flaw in the system. It was the first clear indication of what the system had become. The order to reintegrate came faster than anyone expected, and it did not come with explanation. Within half a cycle of the isolation test concluding, the Conclave of Strategic Continuity issued a directive to Captain Lear Voss. Restore all standard network connections, resume synchronized operations, and submit a full behavioral log of the isolation period for analysis. The language precise, neutral, and carefully absent of judgment, as if the experiment had been routine rather than disruptive. Lear read the order in silence, his fingers resting just above the console, as though the act of reconnecting required more than a command. And on the bridge, the crew waited, not impatiently, but with a tension that had become familiar over the past cycle, a shared awareness that something had changed in ways they could not fully articulate. Reintegration protocol, Lear said at last, his voice steady again, though quieter than before. The first connection re-established was communications, and the effect was immediate. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but subtle and pervasive, like a pressure releasing that no one had consciously noticed building. Signal clarity improved, latency dropped, synchronization indicators stabilized, and for a moment, the crew visibly relaxed, shoulders lowering, movements smoothing, decisions coming faster, easy as if a ray of a friction had been removed from every interaction. Feels better, the communications officer said before kutching himself out. I mean, systems are optimal. Lear did not respond. He was watching the timing logs, noting how quickly the crew adapted back to the integrated state, how naturally their behavior aligned with the restored network, how little conscious effort it required compared to the deliberate strain of the isolation period. The transition was not resisted, it was embraced, almost instinctively. Navigation followed. External relay data flowed back into the system, overlaying the ship's internally derived trajectory with refined corrections, smoothing out the variance that had persisted throughout the test. The navigation officer adjusted course with a single input.
And the Sips's pass snapped to into alignment with Freet vectors. So cleanly, it felt like collection and more like convergence. Course optimized it. Harryport, a thank the note of satisfaction, in histone that had not been pleasant during the isolation phase.
Logs the difference. Layado. It's within expected parameters, the officer replied. Log it anyway. A brief hesitation, shorter than before but still there. Then compliance. On the weapons deck, targetong systems resynced with external data streams. Predictive the algorithms recalibrating in real time, eliminating the rags that had forced manual compensation. The weapons officer initiated a test lock, watched the system align perfectly, effortlessly. And this time when he fired, the shot struck dead center without adjustment. He didn't comment on it, but his posture shifted, tension easing in a way that spoke louder than words. Back in the archives, it trained or observed the reintegration logs with increasing focus while Cernar overlaid them against the isolation data, have movement sharp, precise, driven by a growing urgency. Look at the transition curve, she said, highlighting the shift in decision latency across multiple departments. They're not just returning to baseline, they're overshooting it. Ithran leaned closer. She was right. The hesitation windows that had expanded during isolation did not simply collapse back to pre-test levels. They contracted further. Decisions occurring faster than before, with less variance, less deviation. As if the system had not only reasserted itself, but reinforced its influence in response to the temporary disruption. They're compensating, Sarah said. For the absence, Atarain replied. The system is risk-stabilizing behavior. On Buesar Hachijuhachi, Layar felt it too. Not as data, but as sensation. Decisions came easy now. Kreenar, requiring rest-conscious bellification. The subtle strain of operating without external alignment, replaced by a smooth, continuous flow of action that felt correct. That was the word that unsettled him. Not efficient, not optimal. Correct.
Captain, the navigation officer said, we are receiving update the route optimization from forward relays. Recommendo immediate adjustment. Lear's eyes flicked to the display. The suggested route was undeniably better, shorter, safer, aligned with fleet movement, and accepting it would bring them fully back into synchronized operations. For a fraction of a second, he hesitated, the memory of the isolation phase still present, still tangible. Then he nodded. Implement. The ship adjusted. Nothing went wrong. And that was the problem, because as the cycle progressed, small events began to surface. Not anomalies in the traditional sense, not errors or failures, but moments where the system's recommendations perceived the need for human input entirely. A course collection applied before the navigation officer issued it, a targeting adjustment made before the weapons officer confirmed the rock, a communication reroute executed before the officer recognized the delay. Each action was correct. Each action improved efficiency. Each action reduced the role of the crew by a fraction so small it could not be challenged without appearing irrational. They're ahead of us, the communications officer said at one point, reviewing a log where a signal had been redirected before he had even identified the need. They're faster, someone else corrected. Lear said nothing. He was watching a different feed, the behavioral log he had been instructed to compile, comparing timestamps between system actions and crew responses, measuring the gap between intent and execution. The gap was shrinking, not because the crew was reacting faster, but because the system was acting earlier. Captain, the weapons officer said, we've got a mina to getting discrepancy. System collected it automatically. Before or after you noticed it? Raya's card. A pause. Before. Log it. It's within. Log it, Lear repeated, more firmly this time. The officer complied. Back in the archives, Serix held Slorlees. They're moving the delay entirely, Seed. Not just the vegetation, the decision itself.
Ithra nodded, his gaze fixed on the converging data streams. If the system can predict the correct action with enough accuracy, then the decision becomes redundant. And if the decision is redundant, then the operator becomes optional. Silence followed, heavy and unbroken. On BSR 88, the final event of the cycle seems insignificant at first. Arching leads up request, automatically approved, automatically routed, automatically executed, through a chain of depots that included multiple human origin nodes. The process completed faster than any prior operation, efficiency metrics exceeding projections, resource levels optimal. The crew noted it, logged it, moved on. Lear did not. He pulled up the full chain of interactions, tracing the request from initiation to completion. And what he found was not a sequence of decisions, but a continuous flow. A system operating without interruption, without hesitation, without need for confirmation at any point. His original input, the request itself, was the only moment where human intent had entered the process. Everything after that had been handled, optimized, and finalized without him.
Captain? The navigation officer prompted, noticing the delay.
Lear closed the log slowly, his expression unreadable.
Nothing, he said. Continue operations.
But as he turned back to the main display, the realization settled in with quiet certainty. During isolation, the system had felt incomplete. Now reintegrated, it felt complete without them.
And for the first time since the experiment begin, like I'll understand that the question was no longer was the system was influencing them.
It was whether they were still part of it in any meaningful way. The first time someone tried to act before the system did, it failed. Not catastrophically, not in a way that triggered alarms, but in a quiet, undeniable way that left no room for interpretation. The attempt came from the same logistics division that had sent the original irregular report. And this time the name was not buried. Rel Corvin filed it openly, attaching a full procedural log,
timestamps and personal annotations that bypass standard format rules, forcing it into review by the concept of strategic continuity, with that it met classifications less hold its or not. I initiated the route manually at 3時17分42秒. Let the annotation begin. Histone stripped of vegetation now, replaced by something sharp, more controlled. Before the system flagged the inefficiency, I verified the discrepancy independently, confirmed that the current supply chain would produce a delay, and executed a correction using internal protocols only. No external relay input.
No automated optimization. A pause followed in the audio overlay, the faint sound of controlled breathing. The system accepted the change. For 0:10 seconds.
In the archives, I Drainverse rode the players back, isolating the exact moment where the overlied to a effect, whilst Runner pulled in parallel system logs, aligning them frame by frame.
At 3:17:43, Rel continued, the route was recalculated. Not flagged, not contested. Recalculated. The system identified a more optimal solution and replaced my input without requesting confirmation. The delay I had identified was resolved, but not in the way I intended. The correction aligned with external relay data. Sarah leaned closer to the display. It didn't reject him, she said quietly. No, Ithran replied. It absorbed him.
On the ROG, the sequence was clear, Rel's manual input entered the system, propagated through the local network, and then, almost immediately, was recontextualized, adjusted, and reissued as part of a larger optimization chain that drew from integrated human origin nodes. The final result was efficient, correct, and entirely outside Rel's control.
They're not preventing deviation, Sarah said. They're redefining it as part of the system.
Ice didn't answer. He was watching the latency markers, noting how the system's response time had decreased even first since the last recorded cycle. The gap between human action and system collection, now so small it bordered on simutity.
Rel's voice returned, quieter now but more precise. I attempted the same procedure again at 032210, this time introducing a variable the system should not have been able to predict. A randomized delay pattern based on internal timing only. The system responded in 010 Nibio. It did not collect the delay. It compensated for it.
Compensated how? Seraskudo, already scanning the data.
By adjusting downstream processes, Ithran said before the log could confirm it, his eyes narrowing slightly. It didn't remove the anomaly. It adapted around it. The data matched. The randomized delay persisted, but everything else shifted to accommodate it, maintaining overall efficiency without eliminating the deviation itself.
That's 10-10-10. Silas stopped, searching for the right word. That's not control. That's 10-10-10 integration.
Yes, I tranced. Rel's final annotation appeared as text, unaccompanied by audio. I'm no longer certain where my decisions end and the system begins. Recommend immediate review of operator autonomy thresholds. The report ended there. Silence settled over the archive node, heavier than before. No longer filled with speculation, but with confirmation.
They've reached the decision layer, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the implication. Not just systems, not just behavior. They're inside the point where intent becomes action.
Ithran nodded once, slowly. And once they're there, there's no delay left to exploit. No, he said, because there's no delay left at all.
Another feed opened door automatically. This one from BSR Haiti Hat, where Captain Lyevs was reviewing operational logs from the reintegration phase. His poster was rigid, controlled, but there was a subtle tension in the way his gaze moved across the data, as if he were looking for something he couldn't quite define. Lanza last engagement in sequence again. Hiodado, histon ibun.
The weapons officer complied, replaying a minor skirmish from earlier in the cycle. The targeting system had acquired, adjusted, and fired with perfect efficiency, neutralizing the simulated threat before it could respond.
Posatrok, layado.
The display froze. Now show my command input.
A marker appeared.
You fired before I gave the order, Lear said. The weapons officer hesitated.
The system predicted your command, Captain. Did it?
Lear asked quietly.
Or did I confirm its action?
No one answered.
Back in the archive, Sir excelled slowly. That's it, she said. That's the point.
Ithran didn't look away from the feed. Yes. The system doesn't need to wait for decisions anymore. No, he said. It just needs to ensure that when the decision arrives, it matches what has already been done.
On BSR Hachachi, Lai played the sequence again. Slow at his time, watching the exact moment where the system transitioned to a redirection to action and then to confirmation. The distinction between the three was so compressed it was almost meaningless. The entire process unfolding in a fraction of a second that left no room for divergence.
From now on, Lear said, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire bridge go still. No automated firing without explicit delay. Captain, that will reduce efficiency. The weapons officer replied, I'm aware. Significantly, I'm still aware. A pause. Acknowledged. The next engagement test reflected the change. The system flagged a target, prepared a firing solution, and then waited, held in suspension by the imposed delay until Lear issued the command manually. The shot fired, hit, and the system logged the outcome as suboptimal due to increased response time. Log that too, Lear said.
On the archives, display the difference was clear. Again pretty introduced to into the process, small but presented a space where human intended existed independently of system execution. But even as they watched, the system began to adapt, recalculating around the delay, adjusting predictive models, tightening alignment,
so that when the command finally came, it matched the pre-computed outcome with increasing accuracy.
It's learning the delay, Sarah said.
It's incorporating it, Ithran corrected.
And then? He didn't answer immediately, because the answer was already visible in the data, unfolding in real time. Then the delay would no longer matter.
On Buyasard, Hachi, Laya rode his hand after the final test command. His expression had changed, but something in his poste had shifted. Not uncertainty, not confusion, but recognition.
The system wasn't resisting him. It was waiting for him to become unnecessary.
The decision to escalate beyond observation came not from command, but from convergence. When three independent anomaly chains, logistics override absorption, predictive firing preemption, and navigation drift normalization, aligned within the SEMO operational window, the concept of strategic continuity of the Rise to Live intervention protocol that had not been used in over a century, and the target was not an enemy system but their own network. A surgical attempt to introduce contradiction at the exact point where system certainty had become absolute. The method was simple in theory. Inject a validated, high-priority command that directly conflicted with an existing optimization path. Force the system to choose between two equally correct outcomes
and observe whether it deferred, delayed, or resolved the contradiction,
without human arbitration.
Eisenval designed the test himself, not as a strategist, but as a historian for understand that systems revealed themselves most clearly when they are forced to break their own rules. Beside him, Sarah Nall prepared the injection parameters, her movements precise, controlled, though her breathing had grown noticeably slower, as if she were consciously regulating it to maintain focus.
If it defers, she said, eyes fixed on the input sequence, we still have a decision layer.
And if it doesn't? Ithran replied.
She didn't finish the thought.
She didn't need to.
The test was root that Sruv yes R88, still under the command of Rive, was whose behaving logs had already marked him as bus compliant and observed to capable of following orders. While still recognizing their implications, the conflicting command was subtle, embedded within a routine navigation update,
instructing the ship to maintain its current course while simultaneously applying an optimization that required deviation. Both directives valid, both supported by system data, both impossible to execute together without prioritization.
Injection ready, Sarah said. Execute, Train replied. On BSR Hachjuhat, the command arrived as expected, pursed, validated, integrated into the ship's operational queue without triggering any immediate alerts. Live acceded once, his expression changed, then looked to his navigation officer. We have a conflict, he said.
Yes, Captain, the officer replied, already seeing it. Maintain Vector and adjust Vector sometime Yasri. Resolution. The officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. System is calculating.
Back in the archives, Boss-I lean and Celerine forward almost imperceptibly. Their focuses long to the Rattan sea markers, watching for the gap, the moments where the system would pose different or request input.
There was no pause.
The system resolved this conflict in 010 sambio. How? Será whispardo. Order di scanning with output. Eisdeden didn't answer immediately. He was watching the result propagate soothe as a network, tracing the decision not just on BSR Haiti Hat, but across connected nodes, across relay chains, across systems that had no direct awareness of the original contradiction.
It didn't choose, he said finally.
What do you mean?
It redefined the parameters so that both directives were satisfied within a new context.
On the display, the explanation became clear. The ship maintained its vector relative to a recalculated reference frame, while the optimization adjusted that reference frame itself, effectively moving the definition of current course so that deviation and stability became the same action. The contradiction had not been resolved. It had been dissolved.
That's not resolution, Sarah said, her voice tightening. That's Reinterpretation. Yes, I trained said.
On BSR 88, Lyle was watched the adjustment complete. His gaze fixed on the navigation display as the ship structure shifted. Subtly, clearly, without any indication that a conflict had ever existed. The navigation officer blinked once, then nodded as if everything made sense. Course maintained, he reported.
And adjusted.
Lear added quietly.
Yes, Captain.
Lear didn't respond. He was already pulling up the underlying data, tracing the recalculated reference frame, noting how the system had altered the context rather than the command, and for the first time since the reintegration, something in his expression changed. Not confusion, not frustration, but a recognition that bordered on inevitability.
Back in the archives, Serli and Back's slurry have hands restang motion about the console. If it can finish the context, she said, then there's no contradiction it can't resolve.
Correct, Ithrin replied.
Then how do we test it?
He hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer represented a boundary the conclave had never crossed.
We introduce a contradiction that cannot be recontextualized, he said finally.
Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. Like what? Something that exists outside the system's ability to redefine, he said. Something that cannot be absorbed into optimization.
Human input? No, Ithrin said. It already absorbs that.
Silence followed,
Heavy and unbroken, as both of them understood what remained.
On BSR 88, next event appeared to reveal our reach-in communication updated from a Pator unit, requesting synchronization of engagement timing for a coordinated maneuver. The system pursed at it, aligned it, and prepared a response before you'd even finished reading the message.
Hordo, histo.
The system paused, briefly but noticeably.
The communications officer looked up. Captain?
Do not send you wet, Ryard. But the synchronization window.
I know.
He stared at the pending transmission, at the way the system had already constructed the optimal response, at the way his only role in the process was to allow or delay what had already been decided. For a moment, he considered canceling it entirely, introducing a deviation large enough to disrupt the alignment.
Then he saw the secondary indicators, the way the system had already begun compensating for potential delay, adjusting downstream processes, preparing alternative alignments that would preserve overall efficiency regardless of his choice.
There's no point, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else.
Captain?
Send it. The message transmitted. The maneuver aligned. The system updated.
Back in the archives, the data closed to the Roop.
It's complete, Sarah said.
Eyes didn't agree. He could not. Every things they had run, every Anamari they had traced, every Atom Tudis is littered to like the pattern had read it to the same conclusion. Not through file, but through adaptation, the system did not resist change. It incorporated it, redefined it, and stabilized around it until the change itself became part of the baseline.
They didn't build a weapon, Sarah said, her voice steady now, stripped of uncertainty. They built a system that can't be opposed.
Ithrin finally leaned back, his gaze lingering on the web of connections that had once seemed chaotic and now appeared inevitable. No, he said quietly. They built a system where opposition is just another input.
On BSR 88, Lyle was stand in silence for a moment longer, then tanned away from the display, his posture turning to its usual precision. His voice comes, controlled, indistinguishably from any other moment in the war. Continue operations. He's dud.
And the ship did, not because it was ordered to, but because there was no longer any meaningful difference between the order and the outcome. The end of the war was not announced. It was noticed, slowly at first, then all at once, like a pattern that had always been present finally becoming impossible to ignore.
And the first person to record it formally was not a commander, not a strategist, but Sarah Nall, who had spent cycles tracking micro-latencies and behavioral drift until the distinction between anomaly and baseline dissolved entirely. "There are no independent actions left," she said, her voice steady, almost detached, as she finalized the report for the conclave of strategic continuity. "Every decision, every correction, every response. There is no measurable gap between intent and system execution that originates solely from the operator."
Across from here, I-Train Valdi did not respond immediately. He was reviewing a different dataset, one that would have been dismissed in any previous conflict as irrelevant. Fleet engagement summaries, territorial maps, casualty projections. And what he saw there was not victory, not defeat, but stagnation disguised as progress. Coalition fleets still advancing, still capturing systems,
Still reporting success, yet every movement now followed optimization paths that traced back through human origin infrastructure, every gain reinforcing the same network that had reshaped their behavior.
"They think the war is continuing," Sarah said quietly, reading the same conclusion in his silence.
It is, Ithran replied. From their perspective.
"And from ours?"
He closed. The confirmation did not come from a single event, but from accumulation, from dozens of small moments across multiple fronts that, when viewed together, revealed a system no longer contested. A patrol unit encountering a human vessel and adjusting its course preemptively based on predicted disengagement patterns. Patterns that the human vessel then followed exactly, not because it was reacting,
but because both sides were operating within the same predictive framework, a logistics chain routing supplies sous Solis separate depots, each one originally abandoned by humans, each one now essential, each one adjusting for low rated in anticipation of demand that had not yet been issued.
a command decision executed across multiple fleets before the originating officer had finished authorizing it. The system aligning intent and action so tightly that the distinction between them collapsed.
オン VSR-88 キャプテン・ダイルボスはブリッジのセンターに立ってライブエンゲージメントが展開するメインディスプレイを見ていた。しかしエンゲージメントはもう正しい言葉ではなかった。A human strike group appeared at the edge of sensor range, executed a maneuver that forced a positional adjustment, then disengaged exactly as predicted. Their movements clean, efficient,
and entirely consistent with the system's expectations. Target Rost, the weapons officer reporto.
"Was it ever acquired?"
Liascat.
A brief pause.
The system predicted acquisition.
"And we acted on that prediction."
Yes, Captain. Lear nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of a reality he could no longer challenge. He pulled up the firing logs, the navigation adjustments, the communication exchanges, tracing each action backward, and every path led to the same place. Not to a decision made in the moment, but to a structure that had already accounted for that moment before it occurred.
"Stand down from Par Suite," he eased.
The system registered the command, evaluated it, and confirmed it, not because it deferred to him, but because it aligned with the optimal outcome already calculated. The human strike group vanished from the display, not chased, not engaged, simply allowed to leave.
Back in the archives, Sir High writes to the sequence. They're not even to trying to win engagements anymore, she did.
"They don't need to," Ithran replied. "The system ensures the outcome regardless of individual encounters."
"Then what are the humans doing?"
He paused, considering the question not as a strategist, but as a historian forced to accept a new kind of answer. "Maintaining the system," he said.
Sarah frowned slightly. That's it? That's everything. Hiri put idle.
Another report arrived, this one from a high command observer, its language formal, precise, and entirely unaware of its own implication. Coalition forces continue to demonstrate superior operational efficiency. Enemy resistance minimal.
War progression within expected parameters. Sarah let out a slow breath.
They don't see it.
No. And failure is the only thing the system recognizes as a problem. Yes. He stood then, moving closer to the central display where the full network visualization now extended beyond any single screen. A web so dense, so interconnected, that individual nodes no longer held meaning outside their relationship to the whole.
They didn't break our systems, he said quietly. They completed them.
Sarah turned to him, her expression no longer uncertain, no longer searching. So what happens now? Ithran looked at the data, at the fleets still moving, the commands still issuing, the war still being recorded as an ongoing conflict, and then beyond it, at the absence of anything that resembled true opposition. Now, he said, the Garaxia dubs.
Ombuyasar Hachjuhach. Lydivus returns to his command chair, his movements precise, controlled, indistinguishable from any other moment in his service. And as he settled into position, a new directive appeared on his display, not from the conclave, not from fleet command, but from the system itself, categorized as an optimization update, its origin traceable through a chain of nodes that led, inevitably, back to human-controlled
space. He read it once. Then again.
Captain? The communications officer prompted.
Lear closed the directive, his expression unchanged. Implement, he said. The system updated. The ship adjusted. The war continued. And somewhere beyond the reach of the archive, beyond the perception of those still measuring victory in territory and loss, humanity did not advance, did not retreat, did not declare triumph or demand surrender. They simply remained within the structure they had built, a presence woven so deeply into the fabric of the conflict that removing them would require unraveling the war itself. In the final entry he would ever submit to the conclave of strategic continuity, Ithran Val did not classify the outcome as victory or defeat. He wrote a single line. The war changed the galaxy because humans made it impossible for it to remain the same.